Driving when it's busy and making and earning a lot of money on the fares is great. However, to be profitable, you have to understand your costs. And the most important cost is cost per mile. I believe the cost per mile is broken down into three parts: fuel, depreciation, and maintenance. Let me walk you through all three of them. Fuel is pretty easy, but a lot of people think about fuel when they go and say, I just put $20 into my car and I drove all night. That's how much fuel cost me. But a better accounting way to look at it is by breaking it down per mile. And the way you do that is you look at how much you paid at the pump, divide that by your miles per gallon. That actually gives you the fuel per mile. Here's two examples. Let's say you put $5 of gas in your car and your car gets 20 miles of the gallon. That means your cost per mile for fuel is going to be 25 cents per mile. Now let's imagine that you pay $3.50 for gas and your car is like a Prius and it gets 60 miles of the gallon. Your cost per mile is going to be 6 cents per mile. An electric car is basically the same math, by the way. It's how much you pay per kilowatt divided by the number of watts per mile will give you how much it costs you per mile to drive your electric car. The only complicating factor is the prices vary extremely different from charging at a supercharger or something like that versus charging at your house. The good news is on my website under the Thrive membership, I actually have calculators out there for you to calculate your fuel and whether it's gas or electric. The next cost per mile, and probably the biggest cost per mile, is going to be depreciation. Now, all depreciation means is how much your car gets less in value. So if you bought a car for $10,000 and you plan on selling it for $1,000, it's going to depreciate $9,000. And the calculation is really simple. If you want to know how much that's going to depreciate per mile, just basically take that difference, the $9,000, divide it by the amount of miles that you plan on driving it, and that'll give you depreciation per mile. Here's an example. Let's say your car is worth $10,000 today. And when you plan on getting rid of it, it's going to be worth $500. You're going to take it to the junkyard. That means it's going to depreciate $9,500. Now, let's say it has 100,000 miles today. And when you plan on getting rid of it, it's going to have 300,000 miles. That's 200,000 miles of depreciation that's going to take place. And that's going to give you 5 cents of depreciation per mile. Now, here's why this really matters. Because it's true, it's not an actual cash expense that's happening at the moment. You're not spending any money on depreciation every single week. But knowing this cost gives you the accounting, the cash flow to decide what you want to do. If you owe money on the vehicle, now you know how much additional you need to pay on the vehicle every single week or month. If you've already had the vehicle paid off, maybe you save that money for the purchase of the next vehicle. So that way you're properly accounting for how much rideshare is costing you. And let me tell you something, depreciation is by far the biggest expense most drivers will face. The final cost per mile is maintenance. And maintenance is a similar formula in the sense of like, how much am I going to spend on maintenance? Divide that by the number of miles, and that's going to give me an amount. The problem is each maintenance interval, depending on whether it's an oil change, tire rotations, new tires, brakes, whatever it might be, well, those variables of miles differentiate. So you almost have to calculate each one separately. And then you'll come up with a couple of micro pennies or fractions of a penny, and that'll give you a total maintenance amount. The good news is I have a maintenance calculator on the Thrive website that should be able to help you calculate it all out. You can go through oils, brakes, even some major repairs if you can estimate it today. And knowing your fuel, depreciation, and maintenance, your cost per mile, you're going to come up with a number that you know is your actual estimated cost every time your car goes a mile. Now, I know there are some drivers that say they're going to use like the IRS number, 67 cents or whatever it is. The problem with that is that's not a real number. That's just an IRS number. That number only works if you're going to take that 67, whatever it is, and actually use that from a cash flow perspective and either save that money or whatever it might be. And I'll show you in a later chapter how I manage the cash flow of these costs. Now, here's why the cost per mile matters. I've got two trips, an UberX trip and an Uber Comfort trip. The UberX trip pays $5.57, and the Uber Comfort trip pays $10.44. Now, the UberX trip is only 1.8 miles, whereas the Uber Comfort is 8.5 miles. And when you put our cost per mile of an imaginary 23 cents per mile, it comes up with 41 cents in costs for the UberX trip, but the Uber Comfort trip, because it's so far, actually has $1.96 in costs. Now, if I were to take that profitability, the UberX trip, I make $5.16, whereas the Uber Comfort trip, I make $8.48. And that sounds great. Like, it sounds like the Uber Comfort pays more. However, the Uber Comfort trip is longer in the amount of time that it takes. So if I were to break it down per minute or per hour, the UberX trip is $34.40 per hour, whereas the Uber Comfort trip is $26.78 per hour. When you understand your cost per mile, you're able to make accounting decisions, both while you're actually out there driving and or when you have to manage your cash flow every single week. And that's how you raise your profitability up even a little bit more and make more money.